The morning air bit at Mark Rivera's exposed face as he pedaled steadily along the narrow trail. October in Montana's Bob Marshall wilderness brought a particular kind of silence, the hushed anticipation of winter, when most visitors had already retreated to warmer climates and cozier accommodations. But Mark had always found something compelling about the off-season, about having the vast wilderness nearly to himself. At 31, he had grown accustomed to solitude, finding in it not loneliness, but a clarity that eluded him in the crowded spaces of his everyday life in Missoula. The trail ahead curved through a stand of lodgepole pines, their slender trunks creating a natural colonnade. Mark adjusted his grip on the handlebars of his mountain bike, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders after properly and give wildlife plenty of space. "I've done this before," he had told her over the phone 3 days ago. "I've encountered bears twice on previous trips, and both times they just moved away when they noticed me." "But you weren't alone those times," Elena had countered, the worry evident in her voice despite the static-filled connection. She wasn't wrong. Mark's previous wilderness adventures had been with friends or organized groups. This solo expedition represented something different, a challenge certainly, but also an opportunity to test himself, to find out what kind of person he was when there was no one else around to perform for. The trail began to descend gradually, and Mark let his bike pick up speed, feeling the cool air rush past his helmet. The rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his tires and the occasional call of a Clark's nutcracker were the only sounds breaking the profound silence of the wilderness. He breathed deeply, savoring the pine-scented air, feeling his urban anxieties dissolve with each mile that separated him from civilization. By mid-afternoon, Mark had reached his planned camping spot near a small tributary of the South Fork Flathead River. The site was perfect, a small clearing about 50 yards from the water, with enough flat ground for his tent and a natural windbreak provided by a dense stand of subalpine fir. He leaned his mountain bike against a tree and began the familiar routine of setting up camp, his movements efficient from years of practice. As he worked, Mark remained vigilant, scanning his surroundings periodically for signs of wildlife. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex was home to one of the densest grizzly bear populations in the lower 48 states. Most estimates suggested around 1,000 grizzlies roamed these 1 million-plus acres of protected land, alongside black bears, wolves, mountain lions, and other predators. This was their domain, and humans were merely visitors. After securing his tent, Mark walked the requisite distance away to hang his bear canister from a sturdy branch, using the paracord he carried. Although the hard-sided container was designed to withstand a bear's curiosity and strength, hanging it provided an additional layer of protection and peace of mind. He made a mental note of the distance and direction from his tent, about 70 yards northwest. The light was beginning to fade as Mark returned to his campsite, the October sun dipping early behind the mountains. He fired up his small backpacking stove and prepared a simple meal of rehydrated chili, eating directly from the pouch, as he watched the sunset paint the sky in deepening shades of pink and orange. The temperature was dropping quickly now, and Mark pulled on an additional layer before cleaning his cooking equipment with biodegradable soap at the appropriate distance from his campsite and the water source. Back at his tent, Mark organized his gear methodically. His first aid kit, a comprehensive collection that reflected his wilderness first responder training, was placed near the tent door for easy access. The bear spray canister was positioned beside his sleeping bag, where he could grab it instantly. His headlamp, multi-tool, and water bottle were arranged within arm's reach. These small rituals brought comfort in the growing darkness, a reminder that preparation was the best defense against the unpredictable nature of wilderness travel. As Mark zipped himself into his sleeping bag, he felt the pleasant exhaustion that came from a day of physical exertion in the fresh air. Tomorrow he planned to explore some of the surrounding trails, leaving his tent set up as a base camp. He set an alarm on his watch, though he doubted he would need it. The first light of dawn would likely wake him naturally. Mark fell asleep to the distant sound of water rushing over rocks and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. The wilderness had accepted his presence, at least for now. The first sensation that penetrated Mark's consciousness was an odd scratching sound, like coarse fabric being dragged across gravel. His eyes opened to absolute darkness, his mind momentarily disoriented in the unfamiliar space. The scratching came again, closer now, and Mark's heart rate accelerated as his brain processed the implications. Something was outside his tent. He reached instinctively for his headlamp, flicking it on with trembling fingers. The narrow beam illuminated the nylon walls of his tent, casting eerie shadows as it moved. Mark grabbed the bear spray next, pulling off the safety clip as he'd practiced countless times in preparation for a moment he'd hoped would never come. A heavy snuffling sound came from the direction of his feet, followed by more scratching. Mark's mouth went dry. He knew the protocol for bear encounters. Make your presence known, speak in a calm, firm voice, appear large. But those guidelines were for trail encounters, not for being trapped in a paper-thin shelter with a curious predator outside. "Hey, bear?" Mark called out, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "I'm in here, go away now." He tried to project confidence, but the slight quaver in his words betrayed his fear. For a moment the sounds ceased and Mark felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the bear would lose interest and wander off. Then came a new noise, a low, huffing grunt that Mark recognized instantly as the vocalization of a grizzly bear. His fear crystallized into something sharper, more primal. The wall of the tent suddenly depressed inward near his feet, the nylon stretching under the weight of what must have been the bear's snout or paw. Mark scrambled backward toward the head of the tent, his sleeping bag tangling around his legs. He continued talking, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "Go on, bear. There's nothing for you here. Move along now." The pressure against the tent increased, and Mark heard the ominous sound of nylon beginning to tear. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. The bear was breaking in. In a desperate bid to appear larger and more threatening, Mark sat up fully and clapped his hands together loudly. "Hey! Get out of here!" he shouted, abandoning any pretense of calmness. The response was immediate and terrifying. The bear reared back with a startled woof, then lunged forward with greater force. The tent wall gave way with a sickening rip, and Mark caught a glimpse of a massive silhouette against the night sky. A grizzly bear standing upright, its bulk blocking what little ambient light remained. The scent of wet fur and wild musk filled the confined space. Mark had seconds to react. He pointed the bear spray toward the opening and depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin-based deterrent toward the animal. The bear let out a roar that seemed to vibrate through Mark's entire body, but instead of retreating, it dropped to all fours and lunged into the collapsing tent. Time compressed into a series of fractured, terrifying moments. Mark felt the immense weight of the bear crash against his legs, pinning him down. He continued spraying until the canister was empty, the caustic cloud burning his own eyes and lungs as it filled the enclosed space. The bear thrashed wildly, disorientated and enraged by the spray, but not deterred. Mark felt something close, around his right forearm, the bear's jaws applying pressure that instantly erupted into white-hot pain. He screamed, the sound torn from his throat by equal parts agony and primal fear. The crunch of bone was audible even through his cries, and Mark felt a wave of nausea sweep over him as the grizzly's teeth penetrated flesh and crushed radius and ulna alike. In a desperate bid for survival, Mark curled into a ball, protecting his head and neck with his free arm. The bear released his shattered forearm only to swipe at him with a massive paw, claws raking across his left shoulder and ribcage. Each point of contact felt like a hot poker driving through his skin, and Mark tasted blood where he'd bitten through his own lip. The attack seemed to last an eternity, but probably spanned less than a minute. Suddenly, the weight lifted. The bear backed out of the shredded remains of the tent, huffing and grunting. Mark remained motionless, aware that playing dead was his best chance of survival now. He heard the animal moving around the campsite, investigating, occasionally emitting low vocalizations that sounded almost contemplative. Minutes passed, each one stretching painfully as Mark maintained his protective position, blood soaking into his sleeping bag from his mangled arm and lacerated torso. The pain was beyond anything he'd ever experienced, but he dared not move or cry out. His brain, operating on pure survival instinct now, recognized that the difference between life and death might be his ability to remain still and silent. Eventually, the sounds of the bear's movements grew more distant. Mark risked opening his eyes a fraction, seeing through the torn tent that the night sky had begun to lighten slightly with the first hint of pre-dawn. The bear was still visible as a dark shape against the trees, moving away from the campsite with a deliberate, unhurried gait. It paused once, turning its massive head back toward the destroyed camp, then continued into the forest until it disappeared from view. Only when he was certain the bear had gone did Mark allow himself to move. The pain hit him anew as he uncurled from his protective position, a strangled groan escaping his lips. His right arm hung uselessly, grotesquely deformed where the bear's jaws had crushed bone. Blood pulsed steadily from the puncture wounds, and Mark recognized the immediate danger of shock and blood loss. His wilderness first responder training kicked in through the haze of pain and fear. Tourniquet. He needed to control the bleeding. With his left hand, which was thankfully still functional despite the claw marks on his shoulder, Mark fumbled through the chaos of his scattered gear until he located his first aid kit. The small red pouch had never looked so beautiful. Mark's fingers trembled as he extracted the cat tourniquet from the kit. Applying it one-handed would be challenging, but he had practiced this during his training. He looped the strap around his right arm above the elbow, threading it through the buckle with blood-slick fingers. Using his teeth and left hand, he managed to pull it tight, then twisted the windlass rod until the bleeding slowed and finally stopped. He secured the rod in the clip and noted the time on his watch, 4:37 a.m. The tourniquet would buy him time, but he knew he needed definitive medical care within hours. The enormity of his situation settled over Mark like a physical weight. He was alone, seriously injured, 10 miles from the nearest ranger station, with a destroyed tent and most of his gear scattered or damaged. His bicycle was miraculously still leaning against the tree where he'd left it, but riding was out of the question with his injuries. His only option was to walk out. Moving methodically despite his pain, Mark gathered what supplies he could salvage. His water bottles were intact, as was his small backpack. He retrieved his map and compass, shoved a few energy bars into his pocket, and collected additional first aid supplies. His headlamp still worked, providing much-needed light in the pre-dawn darkness. Before leaving, Mark used his satellite messenger to send an SOS signal with his coordinates. The device confirmed the message had been sent, but reception was spotty. In these remote mountains, and Mark couldn't be certain help would come quickly enough. He had to assume he was on his own. With his injured arm immobilized against his chest, using a makeshift sling fashioned from a torn sleeve, Mark began the arduous journey towards safety. Each step sent waves of pain through his body, but he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping could mean death from exposure or blood loss. The first mile was the hardest. Mark stumbled frequently on the uneven trail, each jarring impact sending fresh agony through his injuries. Shock was setting in, making him dizzy and nauseated, but he recognized the symptoms and forced himself to take small sips of water and deep, measured breaths. He talked to himself constantly, a stream of encouragement and instruction that helped maintain his focus. One step at a time, Rivera. Just keep moving. Follow the trail. You can do this. As dawn broke fully over the wilderness, casting long shadows through the trees, Mark continued his painful journey. The temperature rose slightly with the sun, but Mark felt chilled to his core, another symptom of shock. He stopped briefly to add a layer from his pack, awkwardly draping it over his shoulders, since he couldn't properly put it on without aggravating his injuries. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting as Mark alternated between hyper-awareness of his surroundings and periods where he moved almost mechanically. His mind detached from the pain of his body. He checked his tourniquet regularly, ensuring it remained tight without cutting off circulation completely. The risk of losing his arm increased with each hour the tourniquet remained in place, but that was a secondary concern to survival. By mid-morning, Mark had covered perhaps 3 miles. His pace was excruciatingly slow, but he was making progress. The trail descended gradually, following the contours of the land toward the South Fork Flathead River. Mark knew that if he could reach the river, he would be on a more frequently traveled route, increasing his chances of encountering other hikers or rangers. His mind drifted occasionally to the bear. It had been a grizzly, no doubt about that. The distinctive shoulder hump had been visible even in the dim light, and the sheer size and power of the animal could belong to no other species in these mountains. Mark wondered what had drawn it to his campsite. Had it been attracted by some scent he had missed? Had he unwittingly set up camp near a feeding area or travel corridor? The questions were academic now, but they occupied his thoughts, distracting him momentarily from his pain. Another hour passed, and Mark's condition deteriorated further. His movements became increasingly uncoordinated, and he had to stop more frequently to rest. The claw marks on his shoulder and torso burned fiercely, and he suspected infection was already setting in. The tourniquet on his arm had been in place for over 6 hours now, dangerously long, but releasing it would likely result in catastrophic bleeding. When Mark reached the river around noon, he allowed himself a longer rest. He sat on a fallen log, drinking water and forcing himself to eat half an energy bar despite his lack of appetite. The sound of flowing water provided a strange comfort, a reminder that the world continued to function normally, despite the life-altering trauma he had experienced. As he sat there, gathering strength for the next leg of his journey, Mark thought he heard voices. At first, he dismissed it as wishful thinking or the sound of the river playing tricks on his exhausted mind, but the sounds persisted, growing clearer, human voices, calling to one another somewhere upstream. With a surge of desperate hope, Mark staggered to his feet. "Hello!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and weaker than he expected. "Help! I need help!" There was a moment of silence, then a response. "Hello! Is someone there?" Mark nearly collapsed with relief. He shouted again, trying to project his voice despite his weakened state. Minutes later, 2 figures appeared around a bend in the trail, a man and woman in hiking gear, both looking startled at the sight of Mark's bloodied, disheveled appearance. "Jesus Christ," the man said, rushing forward. "What happened to you?" "Bear," Mark managed to say, the single word encompassing the entirety of his ordeal. The hikers, who introduced themselves as David and Sarah Keller, were experienced outdoors people and reacted with admirable efficiency. David had wilderness medical training and immediately assessed Mark's injuries, while Sarah used their satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation. "They're sending a helicopter," Sarah told Mark after making the call. "There's a small clearing about half a mile downstream where they can land. We need to get you there." With David on one side and Sarah on the other, offering support, Mark continued his journey. The presence of other humans gave him renewed strength, and the knowledge that rescue was coming allowed him to finally acknowledge the full extent of his exhaustion and pain. The clearing was exactly as Sarah had described, a small meadow beside the river, large enough for a helicopter to land safely. They helped Mark sit with his back against a tree, and David performed a more thorough assessment of his injuries, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "The tourniquet has been on too long," he told Mark quietly, "but I don't want to release it until the medical team gets here. They'll have blood products and can manage the reperfusion." Mark nodded, understanding the implications. Even if he survived, his arm might not. The wait for the helicopter seemed interminable, though in reality it was less than 40 minutes. The sound of rotors echoed through the valley before the aircraft appeared, a bright yellow medical evacuation helicopter that circled once before descending onto the meadow, its downdraft flattening the grass in concentric waves. To flight, paramedics emerged and jogged toward them, carrying equipment cases. Their movements were practiced and precise as they took over Mark's care, establishing IV access, administering fluids and pain medication, and carefully assessing his injuries. They exchanged terse, professional observations that Mark could only partially comprehend through his pain and the now welcome haze of medication. Significant crush injury to the right forearm with probable arterial involvement, multiple lacerations to left shoulder and thorax, signs of Class 2 hemorrhage, tourniquet in place for approximately 7 hours. They transferred Mark onto a stretcher, securing him with straps before carrying him to the waiting helicopter. The last thing he saw before the aircraft doors closed was David and Sarah standing at the edge of the meadow, their faces etched with concern. Mark tried to raise his good hand in a gesture of thanks, but the movement seemed to require more energy than he possessed. Inside the helicopter, one of the paramedics leaned close to Mark's ear to be heard above the engine noise. "We're taking you to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. It's about a 20-minute flight. You're going to be okay." Mark wanted to believe him. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying him away from the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life, he closed his eyes and surrendered to unconsciousness. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment pulled Mark gradually back to awareness. He opened his eyes to a white ceiling and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. For a moment he felt disoriented, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between his last clear memory, being loaded into the helicopter, and his current situation. "Welcome back," a female voice said, and Mark turned his head to see a nurse adjusting one of the many IV bags hanging beside his bed. "You've been in and out for about 18 hours. How's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? Mark had to think about it, taking inventory of his body. His right arm was heavily bandaged and immobilized, a dull throb emanating from beneath. The dressings. His left shoulder and side felt tight and hot where the bear's claws had torn his flesh. Every breath produced a sharp ache in his ribs. 6, he answered, his voice raspy from disuse and the lingering effects of intubation during surgery. The nurse nodded and adjusted something on one of the pumps connected to his IV. "Dr. Adler will be in shortly. She performed your surgery and can explain everything. Your sister is here too. She's been waiting since you were admitted. Would you like to see her?" Mark nodded, and minutes later Elena rushed into the room, her face pale with worry beneath her dark hair, so similar to Mark's own. She approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid her presence might somehow cause him additional pain. "Mark," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "God, I was so scared when they called me." "I'm okay," Mark said automatically, though the words felt hollow against the reality of his condition. Elena gave him a look that said she wasn't buying it, but wouldn't argue with him in his current state. Instead, she pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, reaching out to gently hold his uninjured hand. "What happened out there? They told me it was a bear attack, but I don't know any details." Before Mark could begin to formulate a response, the door opened again and a woman in a white coat entered. She was in her 50s with short grey hair and glasses that magnified her alert green eyes. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Dr. Adler. I led the surgical team that worked on your arm when you were brought in yesterday." She picked up the chart at the foot of his bed and glanced at it briefly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I lost an argument with a grizzly bear," Mark replied, attempting humor that fell flat against the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Adler's expression softened slightly. "That's an accurate assessment. You sustained significant trauma, but considering the circumstances, you're doing remarkably well." She moved to the side of the bed opposite Eleanor. "I'd like to explain your injuries and what we did to address them, if you feel up to it." Mark nodded and Dr. Adler continued, her tone professional but compassionate. "The primary injury was to your right forearm. The bear's bite caused a crush injury that severely damaged both the radius and ulnar bones, as well as surrounding muscle tissue, nerves, and blood vessels. We performed an emergency fasciotomy to release pressure in the muscle compartments and restored blood flow to the hand." She paused, allowing Mark to process this information before continuing. "We've stabilized the bone fragments with external fixation for now." She gestured to the metal framework visible beneath the bandages on Mark's arm. "Given the extent of the damage, you'll need additional surgeries in the coming weeks to fully repair the bones and soft tissues." Will I be able to use my arm again?" Mark asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking at the edges of his consciousness. Dr. Adler's expression became more serious. "I can't make any guarantees at this stage. The damage was extensive, and there may be permanent limitations to your hand function and grip strength. However, you're young and otherwise healthy, which works in your favor. With surgery, proper wound care, and aggressive physical therapy, there's reason for cautious optimism." Mark absorbed this news with a numb sense of detachment. The reality of his situation, the potential long-term implications of his injuries, felt too enormous to fully comprehend in his current state. "What about the other injuries?" Elena asked when Mark remained silent. "The lacerations to his left shoulder and torso required numerous stitches, but fortunately, they didn't penetrate deeply enough to damage any vital structures. We're treating them with antibiotics to prevent infection, which is a significant concern with wild animal attacks." Dr. Adler made a note in the chart. "You also have 3 fractured ribs on your left side, Mr. Rivera, but those will heal on their own over time." Mark nodded, feeling oddly disconnected from the catalogue of his own injuries. "When can I go home?" "Not for several days at minimum," Dr. Adler replied. "We need to monitor for infection, manage your pain, and begin planning for the next surgical procedure. The orthopedic team will be consulting on your case tomorrow." She replaced the chart at the foot of the bed. "For now, rest is the best thing you can do. Do you have any other questions?" Mark shook his head and Dr. Adler excused herself, promising to check on him later. When she had gone, Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to talk about it now if you don't want to," she said, "but I'm here when you're ready." Mark looked at his sister, seeing the concern etched in the familiar lines of her face. The weight of his experience pressed against him, demanding release. "It happened so fast," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did everything right, Elena. I hung the food away from camp. I carried bear spray. I made noise on the trail, but it still found me." The words came more easily after that, spilling out in a disjointed narrative as Mark recounted the attack, the desperate application of the tourniquet, and the long trek towards safety. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression shifting between horror, sympathy, and pride at her brother's resilience. When Mark finished, exhaustion overtaking him again, Elena wiped tears from her cheeks. "You survived, Mark. That's what matters." Before Mark could respond, there was a knock at the door and a man in a Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks uniform entered. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Ranger Steve Harding. Sorry to intrude, but I heard you were awake. I'd like to ask you some questions about the incident when you're feeling up to it." Mark glanced at Elena, who looked ready to ask the ranger to come back later, but he nodded slightly. "It's okay. I can talk now." Ranger Harding pulled up a chair and took out a small notebook. "First, I want to say how sorry I am this happened. To you, can you tell me exactly where your campsite was located?" Mark described the location as precisely as he could, referring to landmarks and trail junctions. The ranger made notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "And you're certain it was a grizzly?" Harding asked. "Absolutely," Mark replied. "I saw the shoulder hump when it stood up, and the size it was massive." Harding nodded. "That area is known grizzly habitat. We've had reports of increased activity this fall, likely due to a poor berry crop pushing the bears to widen their foraging range." He closed his notebook. "We'll send a team to your campsite to gather evidence and assess the situation. Depending on what we find and the bears' behavior, we may need to make management decisions." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, her tone sharpening. Ranger Harding's expression remained neutral. "In some cases, if we can identify a bear that has shown aggression toward humans, particularly if it's a pattern behavior rather than a defensive reaction, we may need to remove it from the population." "You mean kill it?" Elena said flatly. "That's one possibility," Harding acknowledged. "But based on Mr. Rivera's description, this sounds like a surprise encounter that escalated, not predatory behavior. The bear could have continued the attack, but chose to leave. That suggests it was likely acting defensively, perhaps protecting a food source or cubs." He turned back to Mark. "Did you see any evidence of a carcass nearby, or cubs with the bear?" Mark shook his head. "No, but it was dark, and I wasn't exactly looking for details once the attack started." Harding made another note. "We'll investigate thoroughly. If you think of any other details that might be relevant, please let me know." He handed Mark a business card, which Eleanor took on his behalf. "For what it's worth, Mr. Rivera, it sounds like you did everything by the book. Sometimes, despite our best precautions, these encounters still happen. It's a reminder that when we enter their habitat, we accept certain risks." After the ranger left, Mark sank deeper into his pillows, fatigue washing over him in a powerful wave. Elena seemed to sense his exhaustion. "Get some rest," she said, standing up. "I'll be close by if you need anything." Mark's recovery in the hospital stretched over a week, each day bringing small improvements alongside setbacks and complications. Infection set in within the crushed tissues of his forearm, requiring aggressive antibiotic treatment and surgical debridement. The orthopedic team performed a second operation to better stabilize the fragmented bones, replacing the external fixator with internal plates and screws that would remain permanently in Mark's arm. Physical and occupational therapists visited daily, beginning the long process of helping Mark regain function in his injured limb. The sessions were grueling and often discouraging, as Mark confronted the limitations imposed by his injuries. Simple tasks like picking up a pencil or turning a doorknob, movements he had taken for granted his entire life, now presented nearly insurmountable challenges. Throughout his hospital stay, Mark received updates from Ranger Harding about the investigation. A team had visited his campsite, documenting the destruction and collecting samples for DNA analysis. They had found clear evidence of a large male grizzly, including tracks and hair samples, but no sign of a food cache or other clear attractant. That would have drawn the bear specifically to Mark's tent. "Based on all available evidence," Harding explained during one visit, "we believe this was a chance encounter with a bear that was already in a state of heightened aggression or anxiety due to the season. Given that the bear disengaged from the attack and left the area, we're classifying this as defensive behavior rather than predatory. Mark had nodded, understanding the implications. So you're not going to try to find it? We'll maintain increased monitoring in the area, Harding had replied. But no, we're not initiating a targeted removal action at this time. The wilderness area contains hundreds of grizzlies, and without distinctive markings or very clear evidence of problematic behavior patterns, identifying the specific bear would be nearly impossible anyway. The ranger's words had left Mark with mixed feelings. On one level, he understood and even appreciated the decision to leave the bear alone. It had been acting according to its nature in its own territory, yet he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease at the thought of the animal continuing to roam the wilderness, potentially encountering other hikers or cyclists. On the day of his discharge, Mark sat on the edge of the hospital bed while Elena packed his few belongings. His right arm was still heavily bandaged and supported in a sling, the incisions and puncture wounds beneath slowly healing. The claw, marks on his left shoulder and torso, had been downgraded from stitches to butterfly bandages, revealing what would eventually become dramatic scars, permanent reminders of his encounter. Dr. Adler entered the room with a tablet in hand, offering Mark a genuine smile. "Ready to get out of here?" "More than ready," Mark replied, managing a small smile in return, despite the anxiety he felt about leaving the security of medical supervision. "I've uploaded all your discharge instructions and medication information to your patient portal," Dr. Adler said. "The most important things to watch for are signs of infection, increased pain, redness, warmth or drainage from any of your wounds. Your sister has the schedule for your follow-up appointments with orthopedics, wound care and physical therapy." Mark nodded, having heard most of this information already during rounds that morning. Dr. Adler's expression became more serious. "I want to be straight with you about your recovery, Mr. Rivera. You're looking at a minimum of 6 months before you'll know the full extent of your arm function, and that's with diligent adherence to your therapy regimen. There will be good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. The psychological aspects of recovery can be as challenging as the physical ones." "I understand," Mark said, though privately he wondered if anyone could truly understand such a journey without experiencing it. "I've included a referral to a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery," Dr. Adler continued, evidently sensing his uncertainty. "Many survivors of animal attacks experience PTSD or related conditions. There's no shame in seeking help for the emotional impact of what you've been through." Mark accepted the referral with quiet thanks, though he wasn't sure if he would use it. The idea of talking to a stranger about his experience felt oddly performative, as if he would be recounting a story that happened to someone else rather than processing his own trauma. Elena drove Mark back to his apartment in Missoula, a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex near the university where he worked as an IT specialist. The familiar surroundings felt simultaneously comforting and alien, as if his ordeal had subtly altered his perception of even the most ordinary spaces. Everything looked exactly as he had left it 10 days ago, yet nothing felt the same. The first weeks of recovery at home established a new rhythm to Mark's life, one dictated by medication schedules, therapy appointments, and the constant, nagging pain that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in his body. Elena stayed with him initially, sleeping on his couch and helping with tasks that his injuries made difficult or impossible, cooking, cleaning, even some aspects of personal care that Mark found humiliating to require assistance with. When she eventually had to return to her own life and job in Bozeman, Mark confronted the reality of his independence, or rather, his new lack of it. Simple activities became complex challenges, opening a jar with one hand, buttoning a shirt with limited dexterity, carrying a glass of water from the kitchen to the living room without spilling it. Each small victory felt monumental, each failure devastating. Physical therapy sessions were the most difficult part of Mark's recovery routine. His therapist, a former Army medic named Travis, pushed him relentlessly, combining encouragement with a no-nonsense approach that allowed no room for self-pity. "The nerves and muscles are there," Travis would say, as Mark struggled through another set of finger exercises, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of trying to pick up a small wooden block. "They're damaged, but they're there. We just need to remind them how to work together again." Some days Mark believed him. Other days, when pain flared through his arm like electrical current or his fingers refused to obey the most basic commands from his brain, Despair threatened to overwhelm him. On those days, he would return home from therapy and sit in silence, staring at the mountain bike that still leaned against his living room wall, a totem of a freedom he feared he might never fully regain. 6 weeks after the attack, Mark returned to work on a part-time basis. His colleagues at the university IT department welcomed him back with a mixture of curiosity and concern, their questions about his experience revealing an unsettling blend of horror and fascination. Mark found himself recounting a sanitized version of the attack, one that acknowledged the danger while minimizing the terror and pain he had experienced. "Yeah, I was pretty lucky," he would say with a forced smile when someone expressed amazement at his survival. "The tourniquet probably saved my life." Only his immediate supervisor, Diane, seemed to recognize the toll that repeatedly narrating the experience was taking on him. She created a buffer when necessary, steering conversations away from the attack and back to work matters. Mark was grateful for her perceptiveness, though he never said so explicitly. As autumn deepened into winter, the physical landscape of Montana transformed under blankets of snow, mirroring the internal shifts in Mark's recovery journey. His wounds healed slowly but steadily, pink scar tissue replacing open injuries. The external fixator was removed from his arm, though the plates and screws remained, holding the shattered bones in place as they fused. His range of motion improved incrementally, and tasks that had seemed impossible in the early weeks gradually became merely difficult. Yet for all the physical progress, the psychological impact of the attack lingered like a shadow. Mark found himself avoiding wooded areas, his heart rate accelerating whenever he glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by vivid dreams in which he relived the attack, with variations that often ended worse than reality had. He began leaving lights on at night, the darkness itself becoming an adversary to be kept at bay. 3 months after the attack, Mark received an unexpected email from a journalist at the Missoulian, the local newspaper. The reporter had apparently heard about his encounter through contacts at Fish, Wildlife and Parks and was interested in interviewing Mark for a piece on bear safety and wilderness recreation. Mark's first instinct was to decline. The idea of having his experience dissected for public consumption made him deeply uncomfortable, but after consideration, he recognized an opportunity to process his own trauma while potentially helping others avoid similar situations. He agreed to the interview on the condition that it focus on educational aspects rather than sensationalizing the attack itself. The journalist, a woman named Tara Whitcomb, met Mark at a coffee shop near campus on a snowy December afternoon. She was younger than Mark had expected, perhaps in her mid-20s with a recorder and notebook ready, as she asked thoughtful, well-researched questions about his preparation, the attack and his recovery. "Do you think there was anything you could have done differently?" she asked toward the end of their conversation, her pen poised above her notes. Mark considered the question carefully, having asked himself the same thing countless times during sleepless nights. "I followed all the standard protocols," he said finally. "My bear canister was properly hung away from camp. I carried bear spray and knew how to use it. My campsite was in an appropriate location." He paused, turning his coffee cup slowly with his good hand. "But maybe I could have been more aware of my surroundings when setting up camp, looked for signs of recent bear activity in the area. Maybe I should have camped near other people instead of seeking solitude." Tara nodded, making notes. "Would you go back into the wilderness again? Back to the Bob Marshall?" The question struck at the heart of something Mark had been avoiding confronting directly. He looked down at his right hand, at the fingers that still didn't quite close into a proper fist, at the surgical scars that mapped the path of the bear's teeth through his flesh. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty of the answer surprising even himself. "I've always found something essential out there, something I need, but now I'm not sure if the cost is worth it." The article appeared in the Sunday edition a week later, accompanied by a photo of Mark standing beside his mountain bike, his injured arm partially visible in its brace. The piece was respectful and educational, emphasizing bear safety practices while acknowledging the inherent risks of wilderness recreation. Mark found it strange to see his experience rendered in print, transformed into a cautionary tale for others. In the days following publication, Mark received a handful of emails and messages from strangers who had read the article. Some shared their own wilderness encounters, while others simply expressed sympathy or admiration for his resilience. One message in particular stood out, an email from a retired wildlife biologist who had studied grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for decades. Your encounter illustrates something crucial about coexisting with apex predators, the biologist wrote. We can do everything right and still find ourselves at risk. This isn't a failure of preparation or protocol. It's simply the reality of entering a world where we are not the dominant species. The wilderness doesn't conform to our expectations of safety, and that is precisely what makes it valuable in our increasingly controlled world. Mark read those words repeatedly, finding in them a perspective that helped him begin to reconcile his trauma with his enduring love for wild places. The attack hadn't been personal. The bear hadn't targeted him specifically or acted out of malice. It had simply been a wild animal responding to a perceived threat in its territory. The randomness of the encounter was both terrifying and, strangely, comforting. As winter gave way to spring, Mark's physical recovery continued its slow progression. The orthopedic surgeon who had taken over his case after discharge, Dr. Nasser, was cautiously optimistic about the healing of the bone fragments in Mark's forearm. The nerves remained more problematic, with some areas of his hand still experiencing reduced sensation or strange tingling sensations when touched. Nerve regeneration is the slowest part of this process, Dr. Nasser explained during a follow-up appointment in March. We're seeing good signs, but you need to understand that some of the deficits you're experiencing may be permanent. Mark nodded, having gradually come to terms with this possibility. What about biking? He asked. Will I be able to ride again? Dr. Nasser considered the question. Road cycling should eventually be possible with some adaptations to your bike setup. Mountain biking on technical trails might prove more challenging, given the demands it places on grip strength and fine motor control for braking and shifting. He made a note in Mark's chart. Let's focus on regaining basic function first. Then we can discuss specific activity modifications with your physical therapist. The conversation left Mark with mixed emotions. On one hand, the prospect of returning to cycling, even in a limited capacity, gave him a concrete goal to work toward. On the other, the implicit acknowledgement that his life would require permanent adjustments, accommodations for abilities he had lost, reinforced the profound impact of those few violent minutes in the wilderness. By late spring, nearly 7 months after the attack, Mark had progressed enough in his recovery to attempt riding a bicycle again. Travis, his physical therapist, suggested starting with a stationary bike to rebuild strength and confidence before transitioning to the road. We'll need to modify your handlebars, Travis said during a session focused on this goal. There are adaptive grips designed for riders with limited hand function that could work well for you. Mark ordered the recommended equipment and spent hours in his apartment installing it on his road bike, which he had retrieved from storage. The process was frustrating at times, requiring patience and creative problem-solving to accommodate his still limited dexterity, but the familiar mechanical work provided a sense of agency that had been missing from much of his recovery experience. A mild May evening, Mark wheeled the modified bike onto the paved trail that ran alongside the Clark Fork River through Missoula. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as he mounted the bike, testing his weight on the pedals and his grip on the specialized handlebars. The first few moments were awkward, his body remembering a skill that his injured arm couldn't fully execute. The bike wobbled beneath him, and for a terrifying instant Mark thought he might fall, but then muscle memory asserted itself, his body finding balance despite his limitations, and he began to move forward. It wasn't the same as before. His right arm tired quickly, and he lacked the fine control needed for rapid or precise movements. But as Mark followed the gentle curve of the riverside path, feeling the spring air against his face and the rhythm of his legs pushing the pedals, a sensation unfurled within him that he had nearly forgotten: joy. He rode for just 20 minutes that first day, returning home with his arm aching, but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. The experience became a regular part of his routine, gradually extending the duration and distance of his rides as his strength improved. He stayed exclusively on paved trails, avoiding the temptation of the mountain bike routes that had once been his passion. The wilderness, with its unpredictability and hills, had faded from angry red to silvery white, but remained prominently visible, etching the memory of the bear's teeth and claws permanently into his skin. Mark had adapted to these changes with a resilience that sometimes surprised. His apartment now contained various adaptive devices that made daily tasks easier. He had modified not just his bicycle, but many aspects of his life, finding workarounds for limitations that once seemed insurmountable. He had returned to full-time work and even begun dating again, though explaining his scars to new acquaintances remained an uncomfortable exercise in vulnerability. Yet for all this progress, something essential remained unresolved. Mark still dreamed of the bear several times a month, waking with his heart pounding and the phantom sensation of teeth crushing his arm. He still avoided hiking trails and forest campgrounds, restricting his outdoor activities to developed areas and paved paths. The wilderness that had once been his sanctuary had become, if not exactly a source of fear, then a complicated symbol of loss and trauma. As Mark watched the river flow beneath the afternoon sun, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Ranger Harding, with whom he had maintained occasional contact over the past year. The subject line read simply, "Thought you might want to see this." The email contained a brief message. "Trail camera captured this about 5 miles from your attack site last week," and an attached image. Mark hesitated before opening it, knowing what it likely contained. Finally, he tapped the attachment, and the photo filled his screen. A massive grizzly bear moving through a forest island. It was simply a wild animal living according to the dictates of its nature. Just as Mark had entered the wilderness by choice, accepting its implicit risks even if he hadn't fully comprehended them, the bear moved through its world, responding to imperatives of survival that humans could understand intellectually, but never truly share. Mark closed the image and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The river continued its patient journey beneath the bench where he sat, carrying the fallen leaves toward some distant confluence. He thought about the boundaries between wilderness and civilization, about the illusions of safety and control that structured human existence, and about the moments when those illusions were shattered by encounters with the untamed reality that existed beyond them. He would never return to the Bob Marshall wilderness. That decision had solidified over the months of recovery, not from fear alone, but from a recognition of the unpredictable power contained in truly wild places. He would continue to ride his bicycle on paved trails, finding joy in the movement and freedom it still offered. He would build a life that accommodated his new limitations while honoring the person he had become through surviving them. And somewhere in the remote mountains of Montana, a grizzly bear would continue its ancient patterns of existence, foraging, hunting, seeking shelter, responding to the changing seasons. Their paths had crossed once in a moment of chaos and violence, altering Mark's life irrevocably, but their worlds had separated again, each returning to its own rhythm, connected, now only by memory and the shared landscape of a wilderness that encompassed them both. The bear moved on, and so would he. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. Sarah Whitaker stood at the edge of her kitchen counter, meticulously packing her photography equipment for tomorrow's expedition. At 49, she had perfected the art of preparation, categorizing her gear with the same precision she applied to organizing books at the Littleton Public Library, where she had worked for the past 17 years. Her slender fingers, adorned only with a simple silver band on her right hand, a gift from her late mother, moved with practiced efficiency as she checked each item off her mental list. The evening light filtered through her kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor of her modest New Hampshire home. Outside, the October air had turned crisp, and the maple tree in her front yard had begun its annual transformation, its leaves shifting from vibrant green to brilliant gold and fiery red. It was this spectacular metamorphosis that had drawn Sarah to photography 15 years ago, following her divorce from David. The camera had become both her escape and her connection to the world beyond the library shelves. Filter, spare battery, memory cards, she murmured to herself, tapping each item as she placed it in her padded camera bag. Her cat, Hemingway, a plump orange tabby with one lazy eye, observed from his perch on the adjacent stool, occasionally batting at a stray lens cap with disinterested paws. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen to see her colleague Marion's name flash across it. With a small sigh, she picked up the device and cradled it between her ear and shoulder as she continued to pack. "Hey, Marion," she said, zipping a side compartment of her bag. "Sarah, I was just calling to make sure you're still covering my shift on Monday. Charlie's got that appointment in Concord. And, yes, I've got it on my calendar, Sarah assured her, cutting off the familiar stream of explanation. Marion had a tendency to over-justify, a habit that both amused and occasionally exasperated Sarah. 9 to 5, children's section, story time at 11, I remember. You're a lifesaver, Marion breathed, audibly relieved. So, where are you off to this weekend? Let me guess. Trees again? Sarah smiled despite herself. The White Mountains. The foliage report says they're at peak color, and the weather's supposed to be perfect tomorrow. Just be careful out there, Marion cautioned. My brother-in-law says there have been more bear sightings than usual this year. Something about the late berry season and early frost. I always am, Sarah replied, though she barely registered the warning. In 15 years of wandering the New Hampshire wilderness with her camera, she had spotted bears only twice, both times black bears that had hurried away as soon as they noticed her presence. I'll text you when I'm back tomorrow night. After ending the call, Sarah completed her preparations by laying out her clothes for the early morning departure. She selected her favorite red wool scarf, a splash of color that complemented the autumn palette, and made her feel less invisible in a world that seemed increasingly prone to looking past women of a certain age. Next to it, she placed her sturdy hiking boots, worn jeans, and a layered combination of thermal undershirt and flannel. The White Mountain trails could be deceptively cold, especially in the early morning hours when she planned to begin her hike. Sarah set her alarm for 4:30 a.m., calculated to give her enough time to reach the Crawford Notch trailhead by sunrise. Her chosen path was not among the most popular, a deliberate decision to avoid the weekend crowds that would flock to the more accessible viewpoints. She preferred the solitude and untouched quality of the lesser-known trails, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and the click of her camera shutter. As she climbed into bed, Hemingway made his customary circuit of the mattress before settling at her feet. Through the bedroom window, Sarah could see a sliver of moon suspended in the dark sky. She felt the familiar flutter of anticipation in her chest, the same sensation that had accompanied her on the eve of every photography expedition for the past decade and a half. Tomorrow, she would capture the mountains in their autumn glory, adding to her collection of seasonal portraits that lined the walls of her small home, tangible memories of moments when she had felt most alive, most herself. The alarm's insistent beeping pulled Sarah from a dream of falling leaves. She reached out to silence it, momentarily disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness before remembering her plans. The house was cool. She had turned the thermostat down to save on heating costs, and she dressed quickly, adding an extra layer against the morning chill. Hemingway watched from the bed, clearly unimpressed by her early rising. I'll be back tonight, she told him, scratching behind his ears. Extra food in your bowl, fresh water in the bathroom sink, since you prefer it that way, you spoiled thing. The cat yawned in response, stretching his paws before curling back into the warm depression her body had left in the mattress. Sarah moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. A quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, a final check of her gear, and loading everything into her 2015 Subaru Forester, a vehicle she had chosen specifically for its reliability on the rural New Hampshire roads she frequently traversed. As she reversed out of her driveway, the headlights illuminated the empty street, most of her neighbors still asleep on this Saturday morning. The drive to the White Mountains took Sarah north along increasingly rural routes. As the first hints of daylight began to soften the eastern horizon, she passed through sleeping towns and villages, their storefronts dark, the occasional yellow light in a kitchen window the only sign of early risers like herself. She kept the radio low, a local station playing folk music that complemented the gradually awakening landscape. Her mind wandered as she drove, rehearsing the shots she hoped to capture, envisioning the play of morning light on the multicolored canopy. Sarah had been producing a series of seasonal studies, documenting the same locations throughout the year. Today's expedition was partly to complete her autumn collection for a small exhibition the library had agreed to host in their community. Room next spring, New Hampshire Through the Seasons, a photographic journey by Sarah Whitaker. It wasn't the Museum of Modern Art, but it represented recognition of her work, something that still surprised and pleased her after years of quiet dedication to her craft. The sky had lightened to a pale blue, streaked with pink by the time Sarah reached the small gravel parking area that marked the trailhead. As she had hoped, there were no other vehicles present. The more popular lots would fill quickly as the day progressed, but this secondary entrance to the network of trails remained relatively unknown. She pulled on her backpack, adjusted her red scarf around her neck, and slung her camera bag across her body, securing it against her hip. The trail began gradually, winding through a mixed forest of maple, birch, and oak, their leaves in various stages of autumnal transformation. Sarah paused occasionally to photograph interesting patterns or particularly vibrant specimens, but her main destination was a ridgeline about 2 miles in that offered a spectacular vista of the surrounding mountains. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp soil. Overhead, the canopy filtered the strengthening sunlight, creating a dappled effect on the forest floor. As she hiked, Sarah noted signs of wildlife. A cluster of deer tracks in a muddy section of trail, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the startled rustle of a squirrel darting up a tree trunk at her approach. These were the familiar sounds and sights of the New Hampshire woods, a setting she had come to know intimately through her many solitary excursions. The trail steepened as she approached the ridgeline, and Sarah paused to catch her breath, taking a sip from her water bottle. At 49, she remained fit. Walking was part of her daily routine, and these weekend hikes kept her legs strong, but she no longer pushed herself to maintain the brisk pace of her younger years. The mountains would wait for her. There was no need to rush. When she finally emerged onto the rocky outcropping that marked her destination, the view justified every step of the climb. Below her stretched a valley awash in color, reds, oranges, yellows, and the dark green of the scattered evergreens, all bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. The surrounding mountains rose in gentle waves, their slopes a patchwork quilt of autumn hues. In the distance, a thin ribbon of mist clung to a winding river, not yet burned away by the day's warming temperatures. Perfect, Sarah whispered to herself, already reaching for her camera. She spent the next 2 hours photographing the landscape from various angles, experimenting with different lenses and filters, moving around the outcropping to capture changes in light and perspective. This was when she felt most centered, most present. All concerns about the library, her modest financial situation, her solitary existence temporarily suspended as she immersed herself in the act of seeing and recording the world around her. By mid-morning, the quality of light had changed, becoming harsher as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Sarah checked her watch and decided to explore a side trail she had noticed on her way up, one that led to a small mountain stream according to her trail map. Water features added a dynamic element to forest photography, and she hoped to capture reflections of the colorful canopy on the surface of the stream. The side trail was narrower and less maintained than the main path, requiring Sarah to navigate around fallen branches and overexposed roots. She moved carefully, mindful of her footing on the uneven ground. The sound of running water soon reached her ears, growing louder as she approached the stream. When she emerged into a small clearing, she found herself at the edge of a picturesque brook, its clear water flowing over moss-covered rocks, the banks lined with ferns and late-season wildflowers. The setting was even more photogenic than she had anticipated. Sarah set down her backpack and began to scout for the best angles, eventually settling on a position where a large flat rock extended partially into the stream, offering a stable platform from which to shoot. She carefully made her way onto the rock, testing its surface for slipperiness before committing her weight to it. For the next hour, Sarah lost herself in photographing the stream, capturing the interplay of water, stone, and reflected foliage. She was so absorbed in her work that she initially failed to notice the subtle changes in the forest around her, the sudden absence of birdsong, the stillness that had descended upon the previously active woodland. It was only when she straightened to relieve a cramp in her back that she became aware of the altered atmosphere, a prickling sensation at the nape of her neck, alerting her to something different, something wrong. Sarah scanned the surrounding forest, her eyes moving slowly across the underbrush and between the tree trunks. At first she saw nothing unusual, but then a movement caught her attention, a dark shape partially hidden by a thicket of young maples about 30 yards upstream from her position. She froze, her hand still holding her camera, as her brain processed what her eyes were seeing: a black bear, its glossy coat contrasting with the bright foliage as it moved with surprising grace for its size. Her heart rate accelerated, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. Bear encounters were rare but not unheard of in these mountains. She recalled the advice repeated in hiking guides and ranger pamphlets. Don't run, make yourself look bigger, back away, slowly. The bear hadn't noticed her yet, seemingly preoccupied with something along the stream bank. Perhaps she could retreat quietly before it became aware of her presence. Moving with deliberate slowness, Sarah began to gather her equipment, her eyes never leaving the large animal. She carefully placed her camera back in its bag and zipped it closed, wincing at the sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent forest. The bear's head lifted at the noise, its small ears swiveling in her direction. For a moment, they regarded each other across the intervening space, woman and bear, both temporarily startled by the unexpected encounter. The bear was larger than Sarah had initially estimated, its shoulder height suggesting a mature adult. Its rounded ears and straight, facial profile identified it as a black bear rather than a grizzly, but this provided little comfort given its proximity. Even black bears could be dangerous if they felt threatened or cornered. "Hey bear," Sarah called out in a firm but non-aggressive tone, remembering advice to make your presence known rather than startling the animal. "I'm just going to move along now." The bear rose partially onto its hind legs, a posture that Sarah knew was more investigative than threatening. It was trying to get a better look at her, perhaps catch her scent on the light breeze that moved through the clearing. The red scarf around her neck fluttered slightly, catching the animal's attention. Its nose twitched as it tested the air. Sarah began to back away slowly, maintaining eye contact with the bear but trying not to appear challenging. Her foot slipped slightly on the damp rock, causing her to wobble and instinctively throw out her arms for balance. The sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the bear. It dropped back to all fours and took several steps toward the stream, toward her. "No, don't stay there," Sarah said, her voice betraying a tremor of fear despite her attempts to remain calm. She continued her careful retreat, stepping off the rock and onto the stream bank, never turning her back to the animal. The bear, however, showed no signs of being deterred. It entered the shallow water of the stream, its massive paws splashing. As it began to ford the narrow waterway, its dark eyes fixed on Sarah. She felt a surge of primal fear as she realized the animal was actively approaching her, its behavior deviating from the typical avoidance pattern she had expected. Sarah's retreat became less measured as the bear continued its advance. She bumped into a tree trunk, momentarily disorienting her. When she looked back at the stream, the bear had covered half the distance between them, moving with a purposeful gait that suggested neither fear nor aggression, but rather a determined curiosity that was, in its way, more terrifying than an outright charge would have been. "Back off," Sarah shouted, trying to sound authoritative. She unzipped her jacket and held it open, attempting to make herself appear larger. The bear paused briefly, assessing this new development, then resumed its approach, now fully across the stream and on the same bank as Sarah. Her options narrowing, Sarah remembered the small canister of bear spray attached to her backpack, a precaution she had carried for years without ever needing to use. She fumbled with the zipper of the outer pocket, finally extracting the red canister with shaking hands. The bear was now less than 20 feet away, close enough for her to see the moisture on its nose, the individual hairs of its dense fur. Sarah removed the safety clip from the bear spray and held it ready, backing up further until she felt the undergrowth catching at her pants legs. The trail was somewhere behind her, but she didn't dare take her eyes off the advancing bear to look for it. The animal paused again, its head lowering slightly as it sniffed at something on the ground, perhaps a food wrapper left by a careless hiker or simply an interesting scent. This momentary distraction gave Sarah the opportunity to glance quickly over her shoulder, locating the narrow opening in the vegetation that marked the side trail. She took another step backward, and another, trying to time her movements to coincide with the bear's diverted attention. She had almost reached the trail when her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her stumbling backward. She managed to remain upright, but the sudden movement recaptured the bear's attention. Its head snapped up, eyes focusing on her with renewed interest. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the bear resumed its approach, now with a more determined stride. "Stay back," she warned, raising the bear spray to eye level and preparing to depress the trigger if the animal came any closer. But before she could act, the bear suddenly charged, covering the remaining distance between them with shocking speed. Sarah squeezed the trigger of the bear spray, but in her panic, she misjudged the direction of the light breeze. Some of the caustic spray blew back into her face, causing her eyes to burn and water immediately. She staggered backward, temporarily blinded, the canister still clutched in her hand. Through tear-blurred vision, she saw the dark shape of the bear rear up before her, its front paws extended. She raised her arm in a futile attempt to protect herself as one massive paw swung toward her. The impact knocked her sideways, sending pain shooting through her hip and thigh as the bear's claws tore through denim and flesh. Sarah cried out, dropping both the spray canister and her camera bag as she fell to the forest floor. The bear dropped back to all fours and circled her prone form, its movements suggesting confusion rather than predatory intent. Sarah lay still, partly from shock and partly from an instinctive understanding that further movement might provoke another attack. Blood warmed her leg where the bear's claws had caught her, and she could feel the sting of smaller scratches on her forearm where she had tried to ward off the blow. For what seemed an eternity, but was likely only seconds, bear and woman regarded each other in a frozen tableau. The human sprawled on the leaf-strewn ground, the bear standing over her, both breathing heavily. Then, as suddenly as it had charged, the bear turned away, appearing to lose interest in the encounter. It ambled back toward the stream, pausing once to look back at Sarah before disappearing into the thicket from which it had first emerged. Sarah remained motionless for several minutes after the bear had gone, her body trembling with shock and adrenaline. Only when the forest sounds began to return, a hesitant bird call, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, did she attempt to move. Pain lanced through her hip as she struggled to sit up, and her hand came away bloody when she touched the torn fabric of her jeans. The injuries were not immediately life-threatening, but she knew they required medical attention. More pressing was her need to get away from the area in case the bear decided to return. Using a nearby sapling for support, Sarah pulled herself to her feet, gasping as weight fell on her injured leg. She retrieved her camera bag, relieved to find the equipment inside appeared undamaged, and slung it across her body. The bear spray canister lay several feet away, nearly empty from her panicked deployment. She left it where it had fallen. The return journey loomed before her like an insurmountable challenge. She was at least 2 miles from the parking area, with a significant portion of that distance being downhill on rough terrain, a difficult hike, even without an injury. Sarah fumbled in her jacket pocket for her phone, hoping to call for assistance, but the screen showed no service, a common situation in the more remote areas of the White Mountains. With no choice but to make her way out on her own, Sarah began the arduous trek back to her car. Each step sent waves of pain through her hip and down her leg, and she could feel blood soaking through her jeans, uncomfortably warm against her skin in the cool forest air. She used her camera monopod as a makeshift walking stick, leaning heavily on it to reduce the weight on her injured side. The journey that had taken her little more than an hour that morning now stretched interminably. She had to stop frequently, to rest, each pause carrying the dual burden of delaying medical attention and extending the time she remained in the bear's territory. The downhill sections proved especially challenging, the impact jarring her wounded hip and causing fresh bleeding. By the time the gravel parking area came into view, Sarah was lightheaded from pain and blood loss. Her jeans were soaked from mid-thigh to knee, and she could feel the stickiness of drying blood on her forearm, where smaller lacerations had begun to clot. The sight of her Subaru sitting alone where she had left it hours earlier brought a wave of relief so intense it nearly caused her knees to buckle. With fumbling fingers, she unlocked the vehicle and practically fell into the driver's seat, dropping her camera bag onto the passenger side. The interior of the car felt unnaturally still and quiet after the tension of the forest, a bubble of civilization in which the encounter with the bear already began to take on a dreamlike quality. Sarah started the engine and turned the heater to its maximum setting, suddenly aware of the chill that had settled into her body, partly from the October air, partly from shock. Her phone, reconnected to service as soon as she left the mountain's interference, showed several missed texts from her sister in Boston and a reminder about next week's library board meeting. The normalcy of these communications struck Sarah as absurd given what she had just experienced. She navigated to her Maps application and located the nearest hospital, Littleton Regional Healthcare, about 25 minutes away. The drive required all of Sarah's concentration. Pain throbbed in her hip with each slight movement, and she had to fight against the encroaching edges of shock that threatened to blur her vision and slow her reactions. She talked aloud to herself as she navigated the winding mountain roads, a stream of self-encouragement and practical instructions. Stay in your lane. Watch for the turn ahead. Only 15 more minutes. You're doing fine. When the hospital finally came into view, a modern low-slung building set against the backdrop of distant mountains, Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. She parked haphazardly in the emergency entrance lot and opened her door, only to find that her injured leg had stiffened during the drive, refusing to cooperate as she tried to swing it out of the vehicle. A young couple walking toward the hospital entrance noticed her struggle. The woman, her pregnant belly preceding her, nudged her partner. "Hon, I think that lady needs help." The man jogged over to Sarah's car, his expression changing from casual concern to alarm as he took in her bloodied appearance. "Ma'am, you okay? What happened?" "Bear," Sarah managed to say, the word encompassing the entirety of her ordeal. "I need to get inside." The man called out to his partner, "Melissa, go get someone with a wheelchair." Then he turned back to Sarah. "I'm Jake. I'm going to help you, okay? Try not to move too much." Melissa disappeared through the emergency room doors, returning moments later with a nurse pushing a wheelchair. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with efficiency in every movement, took one look at Sarah's blood-soaked jeans and the pallor of her face and shifted immediately into professional mode. "What happened, honey?" she asked, as Jake helped Sarah from the car into the wheelchair. "Black Bear," Sarah explained again, the simplicity of the explanation belying the chaos of the encounter. "Up in Crawford Notch. It clawed my hip and arm." "Let's get you inside," the nurse said, already turning the wheelchair toward the entrance. "I'm Nancy. We'll take good care of you." The emergency room was mercifully quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Sarah was immediately taken to a treatment bay, where her vital signs were recorded and a doctor summoned. The curtains were drawn around her gurney, creating an illusion of privacy in the open ward. Nancy helped her remove her blood-stiffened jeans, revealing the full extent of the damage to her hip and thigh. 3 parallel gashes, each about 4 inches long, deep enough to have torn through skin and into the underlying fat and muscle. "You're lucky," Nancy commented as she cleaned around the wounds with antiseptic solution. "Bear claws can do a lot worse than this. These are nasty, but they didn't hit any major blood vessels." Dr. Patel, a compact man with kind eyes above his surgical mask, arrived to examine the injuries. "Ms. Whitaker, I understand you had an encounter with a bear today," he said, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "I'm going to take a look at these lacerations now." Sarah nodded, too exhausted to elaborate on the stark assessment. She winced as the doctor gently probed the wounds on her hip, his touch clinical but considerate of her pain. "These will need thorough cleaning and suturing," he informed her after completing his examination. "The risk of infection is significant, with animal-inflicted wounds. We'll also want to administer antibiotics and update your tetanus shot if needed. The scratches on your arm are superficial. They should heal well with proper care. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" As Dr. Patel prepared his supplies, Sarah recounted the encounter at the stream, her voice steady despite the residual tremors that occasionally passed through her body. The doctor listened attentively, nodding at certain points. "Black bears usually avoid humans," he noted as he cleaned the deepest of the lacerations, "but they can become curious or aggressive if they've been habituated to human food or feel threatened." "Was the bear acting strangely before it charged?" "Not really," Sarah replied, gasping slightly as the antiseptic solution stung the raw flesh. "It seemed more curious than anything else. My red scarf caught its attention, I think." "Bright colors sometimes attract their interest," Dr. Patel agreed. "You did the right thing by carrying bear spray, although it sounds like you had some. Bad luck with the wind direction. I'm going to administer a local anesthetic now before I begin suturing. You'll feel a series of small pinches." The next hour passed in a blur of medical procedures. Dr. Patel meticulously cleaned, debrided and stitched each of the claw marks, explaining as he worked that the jagged nature of the wounds required careful attention to prevent infection and minimize scarring. A nurse administered intravenous antibiotics and gave Sarah a tetanus booster, along with pain medication that finally took the edge off the throbbing in her hip. "We're going to keep you overnight for observation, Doctor," Patel informed her once the suturing was complete and fresh bandages covered the wounds. "Animal attacks carry a high risk of infection, and I want to make sure you're stable before sending you home. We'll also need to report this incident to the Fish and Game Department. They track bear encounters and may want to speak with you. Sarah nodded, too drained to argue or even consider the implications of an overnight stay. She would need to arrange for someone to check on Hemingway, perhaps call Marion, since she lived only a few blocks away. And her car. It was still parked haphazardly at the emergency entrance. These practical concerns drifted through her mind as the pain medication took stronger hold, softening the edges of her thoughts. A hospital aide helped transfer Sarah to a wheelchair and then to an inpatient room on the second floor. The space was small but private, with a window overlooking the hospital parking lot, and beyond it the mountains where her ordinary photography expedition had turned into a life-threatening encounter. The early evening sunlight cast long shadows. Across the landscape, the autumn colors muted in the fading light. Once settled in the hospital bed, Sarah finally checked her phone. She called Marion, who reacted with appropriate shock to the news and immediately agreed to look in on Hemingway. "I'll move your car too," she offered, after Sarah explained its location. "Just tell me where the keys are." With these immediate concerns addressed, Sarah allowed herself to sink deeper into the medication-induced calm. A nurse brought her a light dinner that she barely touched, her appetite diminished by the day's events and the residual effects of shock. As twilight deepened outside her window, she found herself replaying the encounter in her mind, analyzing each moment, each decision, wondering what she could have done differently. Sarah was dozing fitfully when a knock at her door roused her. A tall man in the olive-green uniform of the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department entered, removing his cap as he approached her bed. "Ms. Whitaker, I'm Conservation Officer Mike Brennan. Hope I'm not disturbing you too much," the hospital notified. "Tell us about your bear encounter, and I'd like to get some details while they're still fresh in your memory." Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. "Of course," she replied, her voice raspy from sleep. Officer Brennan pulled a chair closer to her bed and took out a small notebook. "Can you walk me through what happened today? Start with the location and time if you can remember." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah recounted her experience again, this time in greater detail as Officer Brennan prompted her with specific questions about the bear's appearance, behavior, and exact location. He nodded occasionally, jotting notes in his small pad. "Sounds like a case of curious investigation that escalated when you stumbled," he observed when she had finished. "Black bears rarely attack humans unprovoked, but they can be unpredictable, especially this time of year when they're actively foraging to build up fat reserves for winter." "It didn't seem aggressive until I fell," Sarah agreed, remembering the bear's almost casual approach across the stream. "Do you think my scarf provoked it? The bright red color?" Officer Brennan considered this. Bears are primarily motivated by scent rather than sight, but unusual colors can sometimes trigger their curiosity. More likely, it was investigating you as a potential food source. "Not to eat you," he clarified quickly, seeing Sarah's expression, "but to determine if you had food." Bears have excellent memories for locations where they've found meals in the past. If hikers have been careless with trash or food in that area, this bear might have learned to associate humans with easy pickings. He closed his notebook and returned it to his pocket. "We'll record this incident in our database and post warnings at the trailheads in Crawford Notch. Given your description, this sounds like a known male black bear that ranges throughout that area. He's been sighted multiple times this season, but hasn't shown aggressive behavior before. We'll monitor the situation, but unless there are additional negative encounters, relocation probably won't be necessary." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of relief at this. Despite her traumatic experience, she didn't want the bear destroyed or even removed from its home territory because of one incident that could be attributed as much to her presence in its domain as to any inherent aggression in the animal. "Will this be reported more widely?" she asked, suddenly concerned about potential sensationalism if her story reached the media. "I don't want this to become some kind of dramatic headline about killer bears in the White Mountains." Officer Brennan smiled slightly. "We'll file the standard report, which is public information, but we don't typically issue press releases for single non-fatal bear encounters. The local paper might pick it up from the police blotter, but without your name unless you choose to share it. Bear attacks are rare enough that they sometimes generate interest, but most coverage focuses on the safety aspects, reminders about proper food storage, and bear awareness in the backcountry." He stood, replacing his cap. "Get some rest, Ms. Whitaker. If you think of any additional details that might be relevant, here's my card. And for what it's worth, you handled yourself well out there. Many people in your situation wouldn't have made it back to their car on their own. After Officer Brennan left, Sarah sank back against her pillows, exhaustion overwhelming her. The pain medication was wearing off, allowing discomfort to seep back into her awareness. Her hip throbbed in time with her heartbeat, and even the minor scratches on her arm had begun to sting again. A nurse appeared shortly with another dose of pain reliever, which Sarah accepted gratefully. As the medication once again softened the sharp edges of her discomfort, Sarah's thoughts drifted. She realized she hadn't even looked at the photographs she had taken earlier in the day before the bear appeared. Those images of peaceful autumn splendor now seemed to belong to a different lifetime, captured by a different woman, one who had viewed the forest as a sanctuary rather than a place of hidden dangers. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams in which she repeatedly encountered the bear, each scenario playing out slightly differently but always ending with those powerful paws swinging toward her. She woke several times during the night, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where she was and why. Morning brought a change of bandages, another dose of antibiotics, and a visit from Dr. Patel. He examined the sutured wounds, nodding with satisfaction at their appearance. No signs of infection so far, he informed her. The wounds are clean and beginning to show early healing. You've been lucky, Ms. Whitaker. When can I go home? Sarah asked, eager to return to the familiar comfort of her own space, to Hemingway's indifferent companionship, to a setting where the events of yesterday might begin to feel less immediate and overwhelming. I'd like to keep you until this afternoon. Complete the full 24-hour course of IV antibiotics, Dr. Patel replied. After that, if everything still looks good, we can discharge you with oral antibiotics and pain management. You'll need to follow up with your primary care physician in 3 days and again with me in 1 week for suture removal. He made some notes in her chart before continuing. You'll need to keep weight off that hip as much as possible for the next week or 2. Do you have someone who can help you at home? The muscle damage isn't severe, but it will be painful, and too much activity could tear the sutures or delay healing. Sarah hesitated. Her sister in Boston was the closest family member, but Jennifer had 2 young children and a demanding job. She couldn't reasonably ask her to drive up to New Hampshire and stay for several days. Friends from the library might help with meals or errands, but none were close enough to offer the kind of continuous assistance Dr. Patel seemed to be suggesting. I live alone, she admitted finally, but I can manage. My house is small, everything's within easy reach. Dr. Patel looked concerned, but didn't press the issue. We'll have a physical therapist and a home health coordinator come by before discharge to discuss modifications and strategies for your recovery period. News sites or social media, not wanting to know if her encounter had indeed made its way into local reporting, as Officer Brennan had suggested it might. The physical therapist arrived mid-morning, a cheerful young woman named Alyssa, who demonstrated how to use the crutches that would support Sarah for the next week and suggested arrangements for her home to minimize the need for movement. The home health coordinator followed, providing information about meal delivery services and transportation options for her follow-up medical appointments. By early afternoon, the discharge process was underway. Marion arrived to drive Sarah home, bringing with her a change of clothes since Sarah's bloodied jeans had been discarded by the hospital staff. Hemingway is fine, Marion reported as she helped Sarah change. Annoyed with me for not being you, but he deigned to eat the food I put out. Your house is all locked up and I moved your car to the regular parking lot here. The keys are in your camera bag. Sarah thanked her, grateful for the practical assistance and for Marion's matter-of-fact attitude, which helped normalize the situation. There were no excessive expressions of shock or pity, just the straightforward support of a friend handling a temporary crisis. The discharge nurse reviewed Sarah's medications, antibiotics to prevent infection, pain relievers to manage discomfort, and an anti-inflammatory to reduce swelling, and provided printed instructions for wound care. Call immediately if you notice increasing redness, warmth, swelling, or discharge from the wounds, she emphasized, or if you develop a fever or chills. Animal bites and scratches can introduce unusual bacteria that might not respond to standard antibiotics. Finally cleared to leave, Sarah was wheeled to the hospital exit while Marion brought her car around. The simple act of standing from the wheelchair and maneuvering into the passenger seat proved unexpectedly challenging. each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her injured hip despite the medication. Once settled, she exhaled slowly, already fatigued by the minimal exertion. "You okay?" Marion asked as she pulled away from the hospital entrance. "You've gone a bit grey." "Just tired," Sarah assured her, though tired hardly encompassed the bone-deep weariness she felt, a fatigue that seemed to extend beyond the physical into some essential part of her being. And sore, very sore. The drive to Sarah's house took just under 15 minutes, during which Marion maintained a steady stream of library gossip and community news, requiring only minimal responses from Sarah. This considerate chatter provided a welcome distraction from the discomfort of the journey and the looming challenge of managing her recovery alone. Marion's organizational efficiency extended to their arrival at Sarah's home. She helped Sarah inside and settled her on the couch, then moved through the small house opening windows to dispel the slightly stale air, putting fresh sheets on the bed and arranging Sarah's medications on the kitchen counter with a written schedule for taking each one. "I've put your phone charger, water bottle, books and the TV remote all within reach," she explained, placing these items on the coffee table. "Bathroom's only a few steps away, but call me if you need help getting up, especially the first couple of times. I'll stay until you're settled." Hemingway emerged from the bedroom at the sound of Sarah's voice, approaching with his characteristic blend of indifference and curiosity. He sniffed her extended hand, then leaped onto the couch and settled against her uninjured side, purring loudly. "At least someone's glad to see me," Sarah murmured, stroking his orange fur. "He missed you," Marion agreed. "Kept looking at the door every time I made a noise in the kitchen." She checked her watch. "It's nearly time for your next round of meds, and you should eat something. Hospital food never counts as a real meal. I brought soup from Kimball's, chicken, and wild rice. Let me heat it up for you." Sarah accepted this care with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort at being dependent. She had lived alone for so long that accepting help, even from a friend, felt like an admission of vulnerability she typically avoided. But as the pain in her hip reasserted itself with each slight movement, she acknowledged the necessity of assistance, at least for the first day or two. After ensuring Sarah had eaten, taken her medication, and had everything she needed within reach, Marion prepared to leave. "I'll come by tomorrow after my shift," she promised. "Text if you need anything before then, groceries, pharmacy, whatever, and the library sends their collective concern. Deborah said to tell you not to worry about anything. Your shifts are covered. Just focus on getting better." Once alone, Sarah felt the full weight of the weekend's events descend upon her. The quiet of her house, normally a comfort after the public interaction required by her job, now seemed to amplify every twinge of pain, every replay of the bear encounter that continued to loop through her mind. She tried distracting herself with television, but found she couldn't focus on the programs. Instead, she picked up her camera from where Marion had placed it on the side table. The memory card still contained the photographs from yesterday morning, images captured in a different world, it seemed, before the bear changed everything. Sarah scrolled through them slowly. The panoramic shots of the valley awash in autumn color, close-ups of particularly vibrant maple leaves, the play of morning light through the forest canopy. They were good photographs, possibly among her best work, yet viewing them now brought no satisfaction, only a hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. She continued through the sequence until she reached the stream photographs, the last images captured before the bear appeared. These were harder to look at, knowing what had followed moments after the final shot. In one frame she noticed a dark shape at the edge of the composition, barely distinguishable from the shadows between the trees. With a chill, Sarah realized this might have been the bear, already present and watching her while she remained absorbed in her photography, oblivious to the danger. Hemingway stirred against her side, stretching before settling back into his preferred position. His warm weight and steady purring provided an anchor to the present moment, a reminder that despite the trauma, life continued in its ordinary rhythms. Sarah set the camera aside and leaned her head back against the couch cushions, allowing her eyes to close. The pain medication had taken effect, creating a buffer between her and the worst of the discomfort. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams once again populated by dark shapes moving through autumn foliage. The following days established a new routine centered around recovery. Sarah's mobility remained severely limited, each movement requiring careful planning to minimize strain on her injured hip. Marion visited day hall to coordinate the visit schedule. "I didn't want to worry you," Sarah explained, watching from the doorway where she leaned on her crutches. "You have enough on your plate with the kids and work, and it's not like you could have prevented it from happening." Jennifer shot her, a look that managed to convey both exasperation and affection. "That's not the point, Sarah. Family is supposed to be there for each other during emergencies. A bear attack definitely qualifies as an emergency." "It sounds so dramatic when you put it that way," Sarah murmured, uncomfortable with the label. "Because it is dramatic," Jennifer countered, closing the dresser drawer with perhaps more force than necessary. "You could have been killed. You're lucky those claws didn't hit something vital." Sarah couldn't argue with this assessment. Dr. Patel had said essentially the same thing during her follow-up appointment the day before. The wounds were healing well, showing no signs of infection, but the doctor had emphasized how fortunate she had been that the bear's swipe had caught her hip rather than her abdomen or throat. Jennifer's presence, while occasionally smothering in its intensity, proved invaluable. She took over the more physically demanding household tasks, drove Sarah to her medical appointments, and provided companionship that prevented Sarah from dwelling too deeply on the attack. They watched movies in the evenings. Jennifer worked from Sarah's dining table during the day, and they talked more than they had in months, catching up on the details of each other's lives that often got lost in their brief weekly phone calls. "Have you looked at the local news at all?" Jennifer asked on Wednesday evening as they finished dinner, a lasagna brought over by Sarah's supervisor from the library. "There was a small article about your encounter in the Littleton paper. Someone from the hospital must have tipped them off. They didn't use your name, just mentioned a local woman injured in a bear attack in Crawford Notch." Sarah shook her head. "I've been avoiding it. Officer Brennan, the conservation officer, who took my report, said they might pick up the story from the police blotter, but that it probably wouldn't get much attention unless I wanted to talk to them directly." "Which you don't," Jennifer stated rather than asked, knowing her sister's preference for privacy. "Definitely not," Sarah confirmed. "The last thing I want is to become some kind of local curiosity, or worse, to have the incident sensationalized. Bears are just doing what bears do. This wasn't a horror movie attack, just an unfortunate encounter that ended badly." Jennifer studied her for a moment. "You're being very philosophical about an animal that could have killed you and left you with what will probably be permanent scars." Sarah shifted on the couch, adjusting her position to ease the persistent ache in her hip. "What's the alternative? Hating an animal for acting according to its nature, demanding they hunt down and relocate or euthanize a bear that was just defending what it perceived as its territory? That seems pointless." "Oh, you've always been the forgiving type," Jennifer noted, her tone suggesting this quality fell somewhere between a virtue and a flaw. "Remember when David left, how you refused to say a bad word about him even though he completely blindsided you with that divorce?" Sarah winced at the unexpected reference to her ex-husband. "That was different. David was a human making conscious choices. The bear was just being a bear." Jennifer accepted this distinction with a nod, though her expression suggested she found Sarah's equanimity somewhat baffling. "Well, philosophical or not, you need to be more careful in the future. Maybe stick to photography in places with fewer large predators. There must be plenty of pretty trees in city parks." This suggestion, well-intentioned as it was, struck at something fundamental in Sarah's relationship with nature and photography. The wilderness had been her refuge, the place where she felt most connected and alive. The thought of limiting herself to manicured urban green spaces, however beautiful they might be, felt like a significant loss. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar creaks of her house and the soft snores of Hemingway at her feet, Sarah acknowledged that something had changed. The forest, once a source of solace and inspiration, now carried an undercurrent of threat in her imagination. When she closed her eyes, she still saw the bear rising before her, still felt the impact of those powerful claws. The rational part of her understood that such encounters were rare, that millions of people hiked in bear country every year without incident, but the visceral memory of fear and pain wasn't easily dismissed by statistics or logic. By the time Jennifer returned to Boston on Thursday evening, Sarah's physical condition had improved notably. She could move around her house with a single crutch. The pain in her hip had diminished to a manageable ache, and the smaller scratches on her arm had already begun to scab over. Dr. Patel had assured her that the healing was progressing normally, and that she could expect to return to most regular activities within 2 to 3 weeks. though he cautioned that complete healing of the deeper muscle damage might take longer. The psychological impact of the encounter, however, proved less straightforward to address. Sarah found herself startling at unexpected sounds, her heart racing momentarily before her rational mind could assert control. Dreams of the attack continued to disrupt her sleep, though with decreasing frequency. And most troubling to her was a newfound hesitation when she thought about returning to her photography in the wilderness settings she had always preferred. On Friday morning, a week after the attack, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. She was sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing emails from the library, when a knock at her door announced Officer Brennan's arrival. He stood on her porch in his Fish and Game uniform, cap in hand. "Ms. Whitaker, sorry to drop by unannounced. I was in the area and wanted to follow up on your case. May I come in for a few minutes?" Sarah invited him in, oddly pleased by this official attention to her experience. They sat in her small living room, Sarah carefully lowering herself into her armchair while Officer Brennan took a seat on the couch. "How's the recovery coming along?" he asked, his manner professional but genuinely concerned. "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "Still sore, still limited in what I can do, but improving every day. The doctor says there shouldn't be any permanent physical limitations, though I'll have some impressive scars to show for it." Officer Brennan nodded. "Good to hear. I wanted to let you know that we've identified the bear from your description and previous sighting reports. It's a mature male that's been ranging in that area for several years. We've posted additional warnings at the trailheads and campgrounds nearby, advising hikers to be especially vigilant about food storage and to report any sightings immediately." "You're not going to trap and relocate it?" Sarah asked, surprised by her mixed feelings about this news. "Not at this point," Officer Brennan explained. "One negative human interaction, even one resulting in injury, doesn't automatically trigger relocation, especially when the bear's behavior doesn't suggest predatory intent. Black bears are native wildlife, and that stretch of the White Mountains is their natural habitat. Our approach is to manage human behavior in bear country, rather than removing bears unless absolutely necessary." He leaned forward slightly. "That said, I'm curious about your thoughts on the matter. Some people in your position would be advocating for more aggressive management." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I was in its territory," she said finally, "and while I took precautions, I carried bear spray, I made noise on the trail, the encounter was still probably more my fault than the bears. I don't think it should be punished for my mistake." Officer Brennan's expression suggested approval of this perspective. "That's a remarkably balanced view. Most people tend to place all the responsibility on the wildlife, rather than acknowledging the shared nature of these encounters." "I've had a week to think about it," Sarah admitted. "At the moment it was happening, I wasn't feeling quite so philosophical." This brought a small smile to the officer's face. "I imagine not. Few people maintain their composure when facing a bear at close range." He shifted slightly, reaching into his jacket pocket. "There's one other reason for my visit. We recovered your bear spray canister during a routine patrol of the area. I thought you might want it as a souvenir isn't the right word, but perhaps as a reminder of an experience you survived." He handed her the red canister, now empty and slightly dented. Sarah took it with a mixture of emotions, revulsion at the memory it evoked, but also a strange appreciation for the concrete evidence of her encounter. The physical wounds would heal and eventually fade to scars, but this object represented something more tangible, a connection to a moment that had altered her in ways she was still discovering. "Thank you," she said, turning the canister in her hands. "It's odd, but I do want to keep it." After Officer Brennan left, Sarah placed the bear spray canister on her mantelpiece, a peculiar trophy from a battle she had neither sought nor truly won. She stood looking at it for several minutes, thoughts circling around the sequence of events that had led to the attack and the changes it had wrought in her sense of herself and her relationship with the natural world. The weekend passed quietly. Sarah continued to gain strength and mobility, venturing onto her front porch to sit in the autumn sunshine, accepting visits from library colleagues who brought food and updates on workplace happenings, gradually expanding her activities within the limitations imposed by her healing body. On Sunday afternoon, she finally felt ready to review all the photographs from her ill-fated expedition, selecting the best images for potential inclusion in her planned exhibition. The process was both therapeutic and unsettling. The photographs, captured the beauty that had drawn her to that particular trail on that particular morning. The vibrant foliage, the quality of light, the sense of wilderness largely untouched by human presence. Yet knowing what had followed their capture cast a shadow over them, a reminder of the wild's indifference to human appreciation, its capacity to shift from sublime to dangerous in moments. One photograph especially caught her attention, a wide shot of the stream where the attack had occurred, the water flowing over moss-covered rocks, reflections of red and gold leaves shimmering on its surface. It was objectively one of her best compositions, balancing color, light, and texture in a way that conveyed both movement and tranquility. But now, looking at it on her computer screen, Sarah saw something else: the perfect habitat for a bear. A natural corridor through the forest where wildlife would naturally travel, drink, perhaps fish for food. In focusing on the aesthetic qualities of the scene, she had missed its ecological significance, its function within the larger system of the forest. This realization brought with it a shift in perspective. Perhaps part of her problem as a photographer had been viewing nature primarily as a collection of visual compositions rather than as a living, functioning environment with its own rules and residents. Her presence in that space had been that of an observer, a collector of images without full acknowledgement of her status as an intruder, a temporary visitor in a home not her own. Monday morning brought Sarah's return to the library for a half-day shift, her first venture back into public life since the attack. Marion picked her up, fussing over her as they drove downtown. "You're sure you're ready for this? Deborah said you can take another week if you need it. No one expects you to rush back." "I'm sure," Sarah assured her, though in truth she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach at the prospect of fielding questions about her experience. "I need to get back to normal life. Sitting at home thinking about it isn't helping anymore." The library staff welcomed her with gentle hugs and expressions of concern, but to Sarah's relief, they followed her lead in not dwelling on the details of the attack. Most patrons remained unaware of her ordeal. The local newspaper article had been brief and hadn't named her, allowing Sarah to ease back into her role without becoming an object of curiosity or pity. It was near the end of her shortened shift when Sarah encountered the first direct question about her experience from someone outside her immediate circle. A middle-aged man she recognized as a regular patron approached the reference desk where she was seated to accommodate her still healing hip. "Ms. Whitaker, I heard you had a run-in with a bear up in the mountains. Is that true?" His tone held genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, about 10 days ago in Crawford Notch. I was taking photographs and surprised a black bear." The man shook his head sympathetically. "That's rough luck. My brother-in-law works for Fish and Game over in the western part of the state. Says they're seeing more bear activity in areas that used to be quiet. Climate change affecting their food sources, habitat fragmentation. Lots of factors pushing them into closer contact with people. That's what Officer Brennan suggested." "Might be happening," Sarah agreed, finding it unexpectedly easy to discuss the incident in these ecological rather than personal terms. "You going back up there when you're healed up? Back to the mountains, I mean?" The question was asked casually, but Sarah recognized its deeper implications. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "I love photographing the wilderness, but I'm still processing what happened." The man nodded as if this were exactly the answer he had expected. "My brother-in-law says the people who do best after wildlife encounters are the ones who don't let fear make their decisions, but don't ignore it either. Says fear is just information, valuable if you use it right, crippling if you let it take over." This perspective stayed with Sarah throughout the remainder of her shift and followed her home, where she spent the evening sorting through more photographs for her exhibition. The man's comment about fear being information, rather than an imperative, resonated with her evolving thoughts about her relationship with the natural world. Perhaps what she was experiencing wasn't simply trauma-induced avoidance, but a necessary recalibration of her understanding of wilderness, not as a passive backdrop for her artistic pursuits, but as an active environment in which she was merely one participant among many, and not necessarily the most important one. The following week brought further physical healing and a gradual return to normal activities. Sarah worked half-days at the library, attended her final follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel where her sutures were removed, and began gentle exercises, prescribed by the physical therapist, to rebuild strength in her hip. The wounds had closed well, leaving 3 parallel scars that Dr. Patel assured her would fade significantly over time, though they would likely remain visible. "You're healing remarkably well," he told her during this final scheduled appointment. "Any continuing pain or stiffness should diminish over the next few weeks. Just be mindful of not overexerting yourself too soon." As October gave way to November, the brilliant autumn foliage that had drawn Sarah to the mountains began to fade, the landscape shifting toward the muted browns and grays of early winter. She found herself watching this transition from a distance, through her windows or during short walks in the town park, not yet ready to return to the forests she had once roamed so confidently. It was during one such walk, almost 4 weeks after the attack, that Sarah made a decision. The weather had turned cold, a light dusting of snow covering the ground, harbinger of the New England winter to come. She sat on a park bench, bundled against the chill, watching a squirrel gather, the last of the season's acorns. The small animal moved with purpose and caution, alert to potential threats even in this relatively safe environment. Sarah thought about the bear, now perhaps preparing for its winter dormancy, its actions that day neither malicious nor personal, but simply part of its existence in a world where human and animal territories increasingly overlapped. She thought about her photographs, about the exhibition planned for spring, about what message she wanted to convey through her images of the natural world. That evening, she opened her laptop and navigated to a website she had been avoiding. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department's page on black bear awareness and safety. She read through the information carefully, noting the recommendations for hiking in bear country, the statistics on encounters, the ecological information about bear behavior and habitat needs. Some of it she had known before, some was new or presented from a perspective she hadn't previously considered. Next, she researched photography equipment designed with wilderness safety in mind, bear bells that could be attached to her backpack, improved containers for food and scented items, even specialized tripods that could double as defensive implements if necessary. The preparations felt neither excessive nor driven by irrational fear, but rather a practical acknowledgement of the reality she had experienced firsthand. Finally, Sarah opened the folder containing her selected photographs for the exhibition. To the collection of seasonal landscapes and detailed nature studies, she added the stream photograph, the last image she had captured before the bear appeared. It was beautiful in its own right, but it now carried additional layers of meaning for her, a reminder of the wilderness's dual nature as both sanctuary and sovereign territory. Sarah decided that her exhibition would include a brief statement about her encounter with the bear, not as the centerpiece or defining element, but as context for her evolving relationship with the landscapes she photographed. The incident had become part of her story as a photographer, influencing how she saw and interpreted the natural world. To omit it would be to present an incomplete picture. In the morning, Sarah checked the weather forecast for the coming weekend. Cold but clear, no precipitation expected. She pulled out her hiking boots from the closet where they had remained since the attack, inspecting them with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Then she called Marion. "Are you busy on Saturday?" she asked when her friend answered. "I'm thinking of taking a short hike in Franconia Notch. Nothing strenuous, just to get some winter scenery shots for the exhibition. I could use some company, if you're free." Marion's surprise was evident in her pause before responding. "You sure you're ready for that? It's only been a month." "I'm not going back to Crawford Notch," Sarah clarified. "And not alone. At least not this first time, but yes, I think I'm ready to try. I can't let one bad experience take away something that's been so important to me for so long." "Then I'm in," Marion declared without further hesitation. "But we're sticking to the popular trails, carrying enough bear spray for a small army. And you're buying lunch afterward." Sarah laughed, feeling a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged begin to lift. "Deal. And Marion, thank you." As she hung up, Sarah glanced at the bear spray canister still sitting on her mantelpiece, not a trophy of victory or a memento of trauma, but a reminder of respect. Respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants, for the boundaries between human and animal domains, and for her own resilience in the face of an experience that had changed, but not defeated her. Outside her window, the first substantial snowfall of the season had begun, soft flakes drifting down to cover the remnants of autumn. Sarah watched them accumulate, transforming the landscape into something familiar yet new, just as her encounter with the bear had transformed her perspective. not through destruction, but through revelation of what had always been present beneath the surface of her awareness. The bear, she knew, would be seeking its winter den somewhere in the mountains, perhaps near the stream where their paths had crossed. By spring, when her exhibition opened, it would emerge hungry and alert, continuing its life in the forest largely unchanged by their brief, consequential meeting. Sarah would return to those mountains too, changed but undeterred, carrying both caution and camera, fear and fascination balanced in a new understanding of her place in the wild world.